The blizzard had been raging for 3 days when Marcus first caught her scent on the wind. He stood at the highest tower of his fortress, watching the storm tear through the valley below with the same detached interest he observed all things, as if the world existed behind glass, untouchable and meaningless. The cursed cold that had settled in his chest 2 centuries ago made him indifferent to Valdoria's brutal winters. What was external frost to a man whose soul had been frozen solid? But tonight, something was different. Marcus's nostrils flared as an unfamiliar fragrance cut through the metallic bite of snow and pine. Sweet, innocent, and beneath it, something that made his wolf stir uneasily in the depths of his mind, a bloodline scent he hadn't encountered in decades. His enhanced hearing picked up the sound before his eyes found her, the soft crunch of small feet struggling through knee-deep snow. Marcus leaned forward, his pale grey eyes scanning the courtyard until he spotted the tiny figure stumbling toward his gates. A child, in this weather, alone. For a moment that felt like eternity, Marcus simply watched. In his 300 years of existence, he had learned that hope was a luxury he couldn't afford, and mercy a weakness that had already cost him everything. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to let the storm claim her. Children wandered into his territory occasionally, usually lost hunters' daughters or runaways from distant villages. The wolves that served him knew better than to bring such complications to his attention. But this child, she smelled wrong, familiar in a way that set his teeth on edge. The girl collapsed against the iron bars of his gate, her small hands gripping the metal as she fought to stay upright. Even from his tower, Marcus could see her lips moving, though her words were lost to the wind. She was speaking to the empty air, as if she expected someone to hear her, as if she expected him to hear her. Against every instinct screaming at him to remain in his tower, Marcus found himself moving. His footsteps echoed through the abandoned corridors of his castle as he descended, passing portraits of the pack leaders who had served his family for generations. Their painted eyes seemed to track his movement, accusing, warning. You swore you would never care again. You promised you would never risk another soul for your own salvation. Marcus pushed the voices away. He was simply investigating a potential threat, nothing more. The child's bloodline scent demanded explanation, and as Alpha King, he had a responsibility to understand what forces moved in his territory. The lie felt hollow even to him. He reached the main doors and paused, his hand resting on the ancient oak. Beyond this threshold lay 2 centuries of careful isolation, of emotions buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself they'd died with Elena. Opening this door meant more than letting in the cold. It meant allowing possibility back into his carefully constructed emptiness. The child's voice drifted through the wood, clearer now that only a few inches of timber separated them. "Please," she was saying, the word barely a whisper. "I don't need much. Just, do you have any leftovers?" The question hit him like a physical blow, not a demand for shelter, not a plea for rescue, just the simple request of a hungry child who had learned not to ask for more than scraps. The innocence in her voice, the trust that someone might show her kindness, cracked something in Marcus's chest that he'd thought was beyond breaking. His hand moved without his permission, lifting the heavy iron bar that secured his doors. The hinges groaned as he pulled them open, protesting 2 centuries of disuse. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of pine, snow, and that strange, sweet fragrance that seemed to wrap around his frozen heart like warmth. She looked up at him with eyes the color of spring grass, impossible in this land of eternal winter. Her dark hair was matted with snow, her clothes little more than rags, but she smiled when she saw him, actually smiled, as if the sight of his scarred face and towering frame brought her relief rather than terror. "Hello," she said simply, swaying on her feet. "I'm Lily. Are you the one who lives in the big house?" Marcus stared down at her, this tiny creature who had somehow breached every defense he'd built around himself. The smart response would be to send her away, to direct her toward the village 10 miles south where mortal families might take pity on a lost child. The safe response would be to turn his back and retreat into his tower, to pretend this moment had never happened. Instead, he found himself kneeling in the snow, bringing his face level with hers. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her young features, the way she trembled from more than just cold, and those eyes, those impossible green eyes that seemed to look straight through his monstrous exterior to something he'd thought long dead. "I am," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "And yes, child, I have leftovers." The words left his lips before he could stop them, sealing both their fates. The girl's smile widened, and Marcus felt something crack deeper in his chest, not painful, but alarming in its unfamiliarity. When had he last seen genuine joy directed at him? When had anyone looked at his scarred features with anything other than terror or calculated submission? "Thank you," Lily whispered and swayed forward. Marcus caught her before she could fall, his large hands easily spanning her tiny frame. She was lighter than she should be, all sharp angles and fragile bird bones beneath layers of inadequate clothing. The realization sent an unexpected surge of protective fury through him, fury at whoever had allowed a child to reach such a state, fury at the storm that had driven her to his doorstep, fury at himself for caring. He lifted her effortlessly, her head lolling against his shoulder as exhaustion finally claimed her. The sweet scent was stronger now, mixed with the salt of tears and the metallic tang of old fear. But beneath it all was that other smell, the one that made his wolf pace restlessly. Bloodline, ancient magic, dangerous recognition. Marcus carried her into the great hall, his footsteps echoing in the vast space that had stood empty for so long. Dust motes danced in the moonlight, streaming through tall windows, and tapestries hung like ghostly sentinels along the walls. This had once been a place of celebration, of pack gatherings and royal ceremonies. Now it felt like a mausoleum, a monument to everything he had lost. His daily existence required no great halls or ceremonial spaces. For 200 years, his world had contracted to a few essential rooms, his study, his chambers, the tower where he kept watch over his territory. He took his meals alone when he remembered to eat at all. He spoke to no one except the occasional pack messenger who brought reports from the outer territories, conversations that consisted of necessary information delivered and dismissed. His days followed the same pattern, dawn vigil at the tower windows, scanning his lands for threats that never came, mornings spent in his study, reviewing ancient texts for some clue to breaking his curse, afternoons walking the battlements alone, his presence enough to keep both wolves and men at a respectful distance. He had built a perfect fortress of solitude, each day identical to the last, stretching endlessly toward a future that held no promise of change. It was a sustainable existence. Safe, controlled, empty. The child stirred in his arms, murmuring something too soft to catch, and Marcus realized he was still standing in the middle of the great hall like a statue. He had no idea what to do with her. His castle had not sheltered innocence for centuries. There were no nurseries here, no soft spaces meant for comfort rather than defense. He made his way to the kitchen, a vast room dominated by a hearth large enough to roast an entire elk. The fires had been cold for decades. His cursed condition left him little need for hot food or warm rooms. But as he looked down at Lily's pale face, he felt the first stirring of something that might have been panic. She was so small, so fragile. What did mortal children need? Warmth, certainly. Food, safety, things he had forgotten how to provide. Marcus settled her carefully on the wooden bench beside the great table and moved to light the fire. His hands, steady in battle and unwavering in judgment, trembled slightly as he struck flint to tinder. The flames caught and spread, casting dancing shadows across the room and bringing a warmth he hadn't felt in years. As the fire grew, he found himself studying Lily's sleeping face in the flickering light. There was something hauntingly familiar about her features, the delicate bone structure, the way her dark lashes cast shadows on her cheeks. That persistent scent of ancient bloodline grew stronger in the warmth, and with it came memories he had spent 2 centuries trying to bury. Elena's voice, laughing as she spun in their garden. "Imagine, Marcus, Imagine little ones with your eyes and my stubborn chin running through these halls." His own response, so confident in their eternal future, "Our children will be strong, beloved. They will know only love and safety within these walls." The memory cut through him like silver, sharp enough to steal his breath. He had believed once that his fortress could shelter love. He had planned for a future filled with family, with the sound of children's laughter echoing through these very corridors. Instead, his castle had become a tomb for those dreams, and he its sole guardian, neither truly alive nor mercifully dead. But now this child slept in his kitchen, her presence already changing the very air around him. For the first time in 2 centuries, his footsteps would not be the only sound in these halls. Someone else would wake beneath his roof, would look to him for protection, for care. The thought terrified him more than any enemy he had ever faced. As if sensing his turmoil, Lily shifted on the bench, her green eyes fluttering open to meet his gaze across the growing firelight. "Is this your home?" she asked softly. Marcus looked around the kitchen, seeing it suddenly through her eyes, the shadows and dust, the cold stone and empty spaces. His sanctuary, his prison. "Yes," he said simply. "Welcome to Thornhold Castle." Lily sat up slowly, her small hands gripping the edge of the wooden bench as she took in her surroundings. The firelight danced across her face, transforming her wide green eyes into pools of liquid emerald. She looked impossibly tiny in the vast kitchen, like a single wildflower blooming in a field of stone. "It's very big," she said, her voice carrying a note of wonder rather than intimidation. "And quiet." Marcus remained by the hearth, every instinct screaming at him to maintain distance, even as something deeper urged him closer. Most find it unwelcoming. "Oh." Lily tilted her head, considering this. "I think it's just lonely." The simple observation hit him with unexpected force. Lonely, as if his castle were a living thing that had been abandoned, rather than a fortress he had deliberately emptied. Before he could respond, Lily's stomach gave a soft growl that echoed in the cavernous space. "You mentioned leftovers," she said hopefully, then quickly added, "but if you don't really have any, that's okay. Sometimes grown-ups say things to be nice." The casual acceptance of disappointment in her voice stirred something dangerous in Marcus's chest, something that felt suspiciously like rage. What kind of life had this child lived that she expected promises to be broken, kindness to be false? "I do not lie, little one," he said, moving toward the pantries, "especially not about food." The pantries held supplies meant for a pack, though he had dismissed most of his household staff decades ago. Preserved meats, wheels of cheese, dried fruits, bread that his remaining cook left weekly whether Marcus touched it or not. As he gathered items, he became acutely aware of Lily watching his every movement with the intense focus of someone who had learned to read adult moods for signs of danger. He set the food before her, perhaps too much, but something in him rebelled at the idea of portions, of rationing what this child clearly needed. Lily's eyes widened at the spread, and for a moment Marcus thought she might cry. Instead, she whispered, "Thank you," and began to eat with careful, measured bites despite her obvious hunger. Even starving, she had been taught manners. The observation added another layer to the growing picture of a child who had learned to navigate a world that offered her little kindness. As she ate, Marcus found himself really looking at her for the first time since bringing her inside. The firelight revealed details the storm had hidden, the way her dark hair caught hints of auburn in the flames, the aristocratic line of her nose, the delicate arch of her brows, and that scent growing stronger as she warmed, tugging at memories he couldn't quite grasp. "Where did you come from, child?" he asked carefully. Lily paused mid-bite, her expression growing guarded, far away. "We were traveling, and then—" She trailed off, her small hands stilling on her food. There was a lot of shouting and running. "Mama told me to hide, and when I came out, everyone was gone." The simple words painted a picture that made Marcus's jaw tighten. Attack. Probably bandits, though in these times the distinction between bandits and soldiers was often academic. "How long have you been alone?" "3 days, I think. Maybe 4? Lily's voice grew smaller. "It's hard to tell with all the snow." 3 days. A 7-year-old child had survived alone in the worst blizzard in decades for 3 days before somehow finding her way to his gates. The impossibility of it struck him with sudden force. No mortal child should have been able to endure such conditions, should have been able to navigate the treacherous mountain paths that led to Thornhold, unless she wasn't entirely mortal. The thought sent ice through his veins, and he studied her more carefully. The scent that had been nagging at him, the sense of ancient bloodline. What if it wasn't just familiar? What if it was specific? "Lily," he said slowly, "what is your full name?" She looked up from her food, those impossibly green eyes meeting his. For a moment, she hesitated, as if debating whether to trust him with the truth. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Lily Blackthorn." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Blackthorn, the bloodline that had cursed him, that had bound his heart in ice and condemned him to this endless half-life, the family line he had thought extinct, wiped out in the magical conflagration that had destroyed everything he loved. But here sat a child bearing their name, their scent, their unmistakable magical signature, the daughter, or descendant, of his enemies, delivered to his doorstep by a storm that defied natural law. Marcus gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white with strain. Every rational part of his mind screamed warnings. This was the trap, the final cruelty of his curse. The gods had dangled salvation before him in the form of an innocent child, but she carried the blood of those who had destroyed him. Caring for her, protecting her, learning to love her, it would all be meaningless when her true nature revealed itself. Or worse, it would be the very mechanism of his final damnation. But as he watched Lily continue eating, humming softly to herself in unconscious contentment, Marcus faced the terrible truth. It was already too late for warnings. In the space of an hour, this child had shattered 2 centuries of careful isolation. Her presence had awakened something in him that he had thought permanently dead. The choice stretched before him like a chasm. Send her away, preserve the safety of his emptiness, and wonder forever what might have been, or embrace the possibility that redemption might come wearing the face of his greatest enemy's blood, knowing that the cost of being wrong would be everything. Lily looked up at him then, cheese smeared on her chin and trust shining in her green eyes. "Thank you for the food," she said simply, "and for not being scary, even though you're very big." Marcus stared down at her, this impossible child who saw kindness where others found only darkness, and realized that choice, like salvation, might sometimes be an illusion. He was already lost. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Marcus remained frozen at the table's edge, his mind reeling with the implications of that name, Blackthorn, while Lily continued eating with the focused determination of a child who had learned hunger was not always temporary. "Send her away," the thought echoed through his skull with the force of a command. "Before dawn, before you grow more attached, before she destroys what little remains of your sanity." But even as his rational mind catalogued the dangers, Marcus found himself unable to move. How could he thrust her back into the storm? How could he look into those trusting green eyes and deliver her to certain death? The blizzard still raged beyond the castle walls, and she was so small, so fragile, and so perfectly positioned to complete your ruin. The curse had been specific in its cruelty. His heart would remain frozen until he learned to love purely again. But should that love prove false or tainted, should it spring from manipulation rather than genuine feeling, the ice would spread. It would consume not just his heart, but his very soul, leaving him a creature of eternal winter, trapped forever in a body that could neither live nor die. What if this child was the final trap? What if some remnant of the Blackthorn bloodline had crafted this elaborate snare, sending their youngest daughter to him wrapped in innocence and need? The thought made his chest constrict with something beyond fear. It made him want to howl with rage at a universe cruel enough to dangle salvation before him, only to make it the instrument of his ultimate destruction. "Are you feeling sick?" Lily's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. She had stopped eating and was watching him with concern, her small face creased with worry. "You look like my mama did when she had bad dreams." The innocent observation struck him like a blade. Here he was, contemplating whether this child was his salvation or his doom, while she worried about his well-being. When had anyone shown such simple concern for him? When had anyone looked past his imposing exterior to see something worth protecting? 200 years ago. Elena used to... Marcus slammed that door shut before the memory could form fully. Elena was gone. Elena's love had been true, and it had been destroyed by the very bloodline this child carried. He would not dishonor that memory by confusing protective instinct with the deeper connection he had lost. But even as he told himself this, Marcus felt the subtle shift in his chest, the faintest warmth where there had been only ice. His cursed heart responding to Lily's presence despite every wall he tried to erect against her. The sensation was terrifying in its fragility, like the first crack in an avalanche that would either free him or bury him completely. "I am tired," he said finally, the admission feeling strange on his tongue. When had he last acknowledged weakness of any kind? "It has been many years since I had a guest." Lily nodded solemnly, as if this explained everything. "My mama said some people forget how to have company. She said it makes them sad inside, but they don't always know that's what's wrong." The casual wisdom in her words made Marcus's hands clench involuntarily. This child saw too much, understood too deeply. Every instinct he had developed over 3 centuries of existence warned him that such insight in one so young was dangerous. Natural innocence didn't observe the world with such clarity, unless it wasn't entirely natural. The thought sent fresh ice through his veins. What if her apparent wisdom came from magical influence? What if every word, every gesture, every heartbreaking display of trust was carefully orchestrated to breach his defenses? The Blackthorn line had been masters of emotional manipulation before their fall. They had built their power on the ability to make others care for them, need them, love them, even when such love led to destruction. Marcus forced himself to step back from the table, to put physical distance between himself and the child who was unraveling 2 centuries of careful control with every breath. "You need rest," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "There are chambers upstairs, warm ones." But even as he spoke the words, a new fear crept into his thoughts. If he gave her a room, made her comfortable, allowed her to settle into his castle, would he ever find the strength to send her away? Already the thought of her small form lost in the storm made something twist painfully in his chest. How much worse would it be tomorrow, or the day after, when her presence had carved itself deeper into his carefully ordered existence? Lily finished the last of her food and slipped down from the bench, her movements betraying the exhaustion she had been fighting. "Thank you," she said again, the simple courtesy carrying more weight than any oath of fealty he had ever received. "I promise I'll be good. I won't break anything or make noise." The eager compliance in her voice, the practiced reassurance of a child who had learned that her continued welcome depended on perfect behavior, shattered something inside Marcus that he hadn't even realized was whole. This wasn't manipulation. This was survival instinct, honed by a life that had taught her to make herself as small and unobtrusive as possible. Unless that's exactly what she wants you to think. The doubt followed him as he led her through the castle's darkened corridors, her tiny hand somehow finding its way into his massive one. Her trust was absolute, terrifying in its completeness. She didn't question where he was taking her, didn't hesitate when shadows loomed from doorways or when their footsteps echoed like whispers in the vast spaces. She simply held his hand and followed, as if she had never doubted that he would keep her safe. And Marcus realized, with growing horror, that he would. Whatever the cost to himself, whatever trap this might be, whatever doom awaited him, he could not bear to see this child hurt. The curse had found its mark at last. The guest chamber Marcus chose lay in the castle's eastern wing, far enough from his own quarters to maintain some illusion of distance. yet close enough that he would hear if she called out in the night. As he pushed open the heavy oak door, dust motes danced in the pale light from his torch, revealing a room that had stood empty for decades. The chamber had once housed Elena's younger sister during her visits, a thought that struck him now with uncomfortable irony. Blackthorn blood had walked these halls before, had slept in this very bed. The realization made his jaw clench as he moved to light the hearth, coaxing flames to life in the cold stone fireplace. "It's beautiful," Lily breathed, and Marcus turned to find her standing in the doorway, her green eyes wide with wonder as she took in the four-poster bed with its faded blue hangings, the tapestries depicting summer scenes that seemed impossibly foreign in this land of eternal winter. Beautiful. When had anyone called any part of his castle beautiful? The rooms that had once glowed with warmth and life now felt like monuments to the dead, yet this child saw something worth admiring in their echoes. "The bed linens are clean," Marcus said roughly, avoiding her gaze as he adjusted the fire. "There are additional blankets in the chest if you grow cold." He should leave now. Should wish her well and retreat to his own chambers, put walls and distance between himself and the growing warmth in his chest that felt more dangerous than any enemy blade. But Lily's small voice stopped him at the threshold. "Will you stay? Just until I fall asleep?" The request was barely above a whisper, spoken with the careful hesitation of someone who had learned to expect rejection. "I know I'm probably too old to be scared, but everything's so different and—" "You are not too old," Marcus heard himself say, the words emerging without conscious thought. "And courage is not the absence of fear, it is acting despite being afraid." Lily's face brightened at his words, and she climbed onto the massive bed, disappearing almost entirely beneath the thick coverlets. Only her dark head remained visible against the pillows, her eyes reflecting the firelight like stars. Marcus lowered himself into the chair beside the hearth, hyper-aware of how the furniture groaned under his weight, of how his massive frame seemed to dwarf the delicate furnishings. He felt like an intruder in this space, a creature of shadows and ice contaminating a room meant for innocence. "Marcus?" Lily's voice was growing heavy with sleep. "Are you lonely too?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Too. As if loneliness were something they shared, a bond between them forged in isolation and loss. How could she possibly understand what 2 centuries of solitude had carved from his soul? "I've been alone for a long time," he said carefully. "Me too," she murmured, her eyelids fluttering closed. "Not as long as you, I think, but long enough to forget what it feels like to not be scared." The admission twisted something deep in Marcus's chest. This child, this possibly dangerous, potentially devastating child, had just voiced the truth he had been running from for 200 years. He had forgotten what it felt like to exist without the constant weight of vigilance, without the assumption that hope was just another word for foolishness. But sitting here in the firelight, watching over her sleep, Marcus felt that weight beginning to shift. For the first time in centuries, he was not alone. For the first time since Elena's death, another heartbeat shared the silence of his castle. It terrified him. This is how it begins, he thought, watching the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. This is how curses complete themselves, not with grand gestures or obvious traps, but with small moments of connection, with the gradual erosion of defenses built over lifetimes. He should wake her, should explain that he had changed his mind, that she could not stay, should send her away while he still possessed the strength to do so. Instead, Marcus found himself settling deeper into the chair, his gaze fixed on Lily's peaceful face. She looked so young in sleep, so utterly defenseless. Whatever blood she carried, whatever purposes she might serve, right now she was simply a child who had asked him to chase away the darkness. And he would. God help him, he would stand guard over her dreams, knowing that with every passing hour, every moment of growing attachment, he moved further from safety and closer to either salvation or damnation. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls as Marcus Thorne, the feared Alpha King who had spent 2 centuries avoiding precisely this kind of vulnerability, committed himself to a path he could no longer see the end of. There would be no going back now. Whatever Lily Blackthorn represented, redemption or ruin, he was already falling. The dawn brought no relief from the blizzard, only a pale grey light that filtered through frost-covered windows to reveal the storm's continued fury. Marcus had not slept. He had remained in the chair beside Lily's bed through the long hours, watching over her peaceful slumber while his mind churned with increasingly desperate strategies. Send her to the village when the storm breaks, find her distant relatives, arrange for her care somewhere far from here. But even as he planned her departure, Marcus felt the wrongness of it settle like lead in his stomach. The village was 3 days' hard travel even in good weather, and winter had made the mountain paths treacherous for experienced climbers, let alone a child. As for relatives, if any Blackthorn blood still existed beyond this girl, they were either dead or in hiding. The magical conflagration that had ended the war had been thorough in its destruction. A soft sound from the hallway drew his attention. Footsteps, measured and familiar, approaching through the castle's labyrinthine corridors. Marcus recognized the gate before his steward appeared in the doorway, Edmund Cross, the only soul who had remained at Thornhold through all the dark years following the curse. Edmund's weathered face took in the scene with practiced neutrality, his master seated beside a sleeping child, looking haggard and conflicted. To his credit, the old man showed no surprise, though Marcus caught the slight widening of his eyes as he absorbed the implications. "My lord," Edmund said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "the storm shows no signs of abating. We may be sealed in for days yet." Marcus rose carefully, mindful not to wake Lily, and gestured for Edmund to follow him into the corridor. Once the door was closed behind them, the steward's composure cracked slightly. "A child, my lord." Here? Edmund had served the Thorn family for over 60 years. He had witnessed the curse's binding, had seen his master transform from a man capable of love into something cold and unreachable. His concern was written clearly across his lined features. "Her name is Lily Blackthorn," Marcus said, watching Edmund's face pale at the revelation. "She arrived last night, near death from the cold." The steward's hand moved instinctively to the protective charm at his throat, a gesture Marcus had not seen from him in decades. "Blackthorn! But my lord, the bloodline is not extinct, as we believed." Marcus's voice carried the weight of his sleepless night, the accumulated strain of wrestling with impossible choices. "She is 7 years old, Edmund. Whatever sins her ancestors committed, she bears no responsibility for them." But even as he spoke the words, Marcus wondered if he was trying to convince Edmund or himself. The supernatural precision of her arrival, the way she had navigated impossible conditions to reach his gates, these details gnawed at him with increasing insistence. Edmund studied his master's face with the shrewd perception of long service. "You mean to keep her?" It was not a question. The old steward had always possessed an uncanny ability to read the currents of emotion that Marcus tried to hide. Now, seeing something in his expression that had been absent for 2 centuries, Edmund understood the magnitude of what was happening. "I mean to protect her," Marcus corrected, though the distinction felt increasingly meaningless. "Until the storm passes, until other arrangements can be made. And if no other arrangements prove suitable?" The question hung between them like a blade. Edmund was asking what Marcus could not yet bear to answer. What happened when temporary protection became permanent care? What happened when a man cursed to emotional isolation allowed a child to carve herself a place in his frozen heart? Before Marcus could respond, a new sound echoed through the castle corridors, a howling that had nothing to do with wind. Both men tensed, hands moving automatically to weapons that were never far from reach. That particular cry could only come from one source: the shadow wolves that prowled the Thornlands, creatures of ice and hunger that served no master save their own predatory nature. "They've never come this close to the castle before," Edmund murmured, his face grim, "not even in the worst storms." Marcus felt ice spread through his veins as understanding struck him. The wolves were trackers, drawn to magical signatures like carrion birds to death. If they were circling Thornhold now, it meant they had caught a scent that compelled them, a scent powerful enough to drive them from their usual hunting grounds. Lily's scent, her awakening magical heritage, growing stronger as she rested and recovered, was broadcasting her presence like a beacon across the frozen landscape. Another howl answered the first, then another, until the sound became a chorus of hunger echoing off the castle walls. Marcus counted at least a dozen distinct voices in the supernatural harmony. Too many to fight, too persistent to wait out. "My lord," Edmund said quietly, "what have you brought into our midst?" The question carried layers of meaning that Marcus was only beginning to understand. This child was not just a test of his capacity for love. She was a catalyst, awakening forces that had slumbered in the magical wasteland of his territory. Her very presence was changing the rules of the world he had built around his isolation. From behind the closed door of her chamber came the sound of Lily stirring, her small voice calling out in confusion as the wolves' cries penetrated her dreams. Marcus straightened, feeling the familiar weight of command settle onto his shoulders. Whatever challenges her presence had awakened, whatever ancient enmities or supernatural threats now circled his home, one truth remained absolute. Nothing would harm her while she was under his protection. The real test was just beginning. The howling intensified, closer now, and Marcus felt the primal edge of his wolf nature respond with a growl that rumbled deep in his chest. Behind Lily's door, he could hear her fully awakening, the soft pad of bare feet on cold stone as she moved toward the window. "Stay with her," Marcus commanded Edmund, his voice dropping to the authoritative tone that had once commanded armies. "Do not let her see what approaches." But even as Edmund moved toward the chamber, Lily's voice drifted through the heavy wood, high and frightened. "Marcus, what's that sound?" The trust in her voice, the immediate assumption that he would have answers, that he would make everything safe, sent a shock of fierce protectiveness through Marcus that nearly staggered him. This was what he had feared most, the moment when her need would become more important than his own survival. "Shadow wolves," Edmund said quietly, his weathered hand on the door handle. "I've heard the stories, but never seen them venture so close to inhabited lands." Marcus nodded grimly. The creatures were remnants of the magical war that had devastated Valdoria, twisted beings that existed somewhere between the physical and ethereal planes. They hunted in packs, following scent trails that could lead them across impossible distances, through conditions that would kill natural wolves. And now they had found something worth hunting. The door opened and Lily emerged, her dark hair tousled from sleep, green eyes wide with worry. She wore the oversized nightgown Edmund had found for her, the fabric pooling around her small feet. Despite her obvious fear, she moved directly to Marcus's side, her tiny hand finding his with the same unconscious trust she had shown the night before. "Are they dangerous?" she asked, looking up at him with an expression that somehow managed to combine courage with vulnerability. Marcus felt something crack in his chest at her composure. Another child might have dissolved into tears, might have hidden beneath the bedcovers or demanded to be taken somewhere safe, but Lily simply waited for his assessment, prepared to face whatever truth he offered her. "They can be," he said carefully, crouching down to meet her eyes. "But these walls have stood for 300 years. No wolf, shadow or otherwise, has ever breached them." It was truth, but not the complete truth. The castle's defenses had been designed to repel human armies and conventional magical attacks. Shadow wolves were something else entirely, creatures that could phase between solid and spirit, that might find ways through barriers that had never been tested against their particular nature. Lily studied his face with that unsettling perception he was beginning to recognize as quintessentially hers. "You're worried," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am cautious," Marcus corrected, but knew the distinction was meaningless to someone who could, apparently, read his emotional state with such clarity. Edmund cleared his throat softly. "My lord, if I might suggest, the great hall would be more defensible than these upper chambers. Stone walls on all sides, only 2 entrances, both easily monitored. Marcus considered this, weighing tactical advantages against the psychological impact on Lily. The Great Hall was the castle's heart, the seat of his power, but it was also vast and echoing, hardly a comforting environment for a frightened child. Yet Edmund was right about the defensive advantages. Another howl rose outside, so close now that it seemed to vibrate through the castle stones themselves. Lily's hand tightened in his, but she didn't pull away or ask to hide. The Great Hall, Marcus decided. Edmund, bring provisions, food, blankets, anything we might need if we're forced to wait them out. As they moved through the corridors, Lily walked between the two men, her small form dwarfed by their height but her bearing steady. Marcus found himself hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, every potential point of vulnerability in defenses he had always taken for granted. Why now? He murmured, more to himself than to his companions. Why her? But even as he spoke the question, Marcus suspected he already knew the answer. Lily's magical heritage was awakening, responding to the safety and warmth he had provided. Like a flower blooming in unexpected sunlight, her power was beginning to unfurl, and with it came consequences he had never anticipated. In the Great Hall, Edmund quickly set about building up the fire while Marcus checked the heavy iron bars that secured the main doors. Everything appeared solid, impregnable, yet the howling outside seemed to mock their preparations. Lily settled onto a pile of cushions near the hearth, drawing her knees up to her chest as she watched Marcus pace. "They're looking for me, aren't they?" she said quietly. The directness of the question stopped him mid-stride. There was no point in lying. Her intuition was too sharp, and she deserved honesty about the danger her presence had brought. "Yes," he said simply. She nodded, as if she had expected nothing less. "I'm sorry. I didn't know this would happen." The apology, offered with such solemn sincerity, nearly undid him completely. This child was prepared to accept blame for circumstances entirely beyond her control, ready to shoulder guilt for simply existing. "You have nothing to apologize for," Marcus said firmly, moving to kneel beside her cushions. "Nothing." Outside, the shadow wolves began to circle. The first shadow wolf materialized through the Great Hall's southern wall, like smoke given form, its ethereal body coalescing into something almost solid as it stepped onto the ancient stones. Marcus felt his heart, that treacherous organ that had only recently begun beating again, slam against his ribs as every instinct screamed at him to shift, to meet this threat with fang and claw. But Lily sat frozen behind him, and the transformation would terrify her more than the wolves themselves. "Edmund," Marcus said quietly, never taking his eyes off the creature as it padded forward, testing the air with supernatural senses. "Take Lily to the alcove behind the throne." The wolf's form flickered between states, sometimes solid enough to cast shadows in the firelight, sometimes translucent as winter fog. Its eyes burned with cold fire, and when it turned its attention toward Lily, Marcus felt something primal and protective surge through him with devastating force. "No," Lily whispered, her small hand clutching at his sleeve. "Don't leave me." The plea shattered something inside him. This was his greatest fear made manifest, not the wolves themselves, but the choice they represented. Protect Lily and reveal the full extent of his cursed nature, or maintain his human facade and risk her life. A second wolf phased through the northern wall, then a third through the eastern. They moved with predatory intelligence, spreading out to flank their targets while more of their pack gathered in the courtyard beyond. The howling had stopped, replaced by something far more ominous, the silence of hunters who had cornered their prey. "Marcus," Edmund said urgently, his weathered hand moving to the sword at his hip. "The child's power, it's growing stronger. I can feel it from here." He was right. The air around Lily hummed with awakening magic, her fear and desperation acting as a catalyst for abilities she didn't understand. The very terror that should have weakened her was instead feeding whatever supernatural legacy flowed through her blackthorn blood. And the wolves sensed it. They pressed closer, their forms solidifying as they prepared to strike, drawn by the magnetic pull of ancient power stirring to life. Marcus made his choice. The transformation began in his bones, a familiar fire that spread outward through muscle and sinew. His human form stretched and expanded, teeth lengthening into fangs, fingernails becoming claws. But this was not the full shift, not yet. He held himself at the threshold between man and beast, letting just enough of his true nature surface to meet the supernatural threat. Behind him, he heard Lily's sharp intake of breath. When he glanced back, he expected to see fear, revulsion, the inevitable rejection that would confirm his worst assumptions about allowing her into his carefully guarded world. Instead, he saw wonder. "You're like them," she breathed, her green eyes wide with realization rather than terror. But different, stronger. The lead wolf chose that moment to attack, launching itself through the air with impossible grace. Marcus met it mid-leap, his partially shifted form giving him the speed and strength needed to catch the creature by its throat. The wolf's body felt like grasping shadow and ice, substantial enough to grapple with but wrong in ways that made his skin crawl. They crashed to the stone floor together, rolling in a tangle of limbs and supernatural fury. The wolf's claws raked across Marcus's chest, leaving wounds that burned with otherworldly cold, but his grip never loosened. 2 centuries of contained rage found an outlet as he squeezed, pouring all his protective instincts into the simple act of eliminating this threat to Lily's safety. The shadow wolf dissipated in his hands, its form unraveling like smoke in a hurricane. But there were more. So many more. The remaining wolves circled closer, emboldened rather than deterred by their pack-mate's destruction. Marcus counted 8, then 10, their forms flickering in and out of solid existence as they prepared for a coordinated assault. "Edmund," Marcus growled, his voice distorted by the partial transformation. "Can you get her out?" "The passage is beneath the throne," the steward replied, already moving toward Lily with his sword drawn. "They lead to the old escape routes." But Lily shook her head, pressing herself against the wall behind Marcus, rather than following Edmund to safety. "I won't leave you," she said with fierce determination. "You didn't leave me." The simple declaration hit Marcus like a physical blow. This child, faced with supernatural predators and the revelation of his own monstrous nature, was choosing to stay, choosing him over safety, trust over fear. And in that moment, Marcus Thorne understood that he had already lost the battle he had been fighting for 2 centuries. Not against the curse, not against the forces that sought to destroy him, but against the terrifying possibility of caring about someone more than his own survival. The shadow wolves attacked as one, and Marcus let the full transformation take him at last. The Alpha King rose to meet them, no longer alone. The Alpha King's true form erupted from Marcus's human shell like a force of nature unleashed. 7 feet of muscle and predatory grace, his wolf-born strength magnified by centuries of contained fury. The great hall trembled as he met the shadow wolves' coordinated assault, claws meeting ethereal fangs in a symphony of supernatural violence. For a moment, it seemed he might prevail through sheer ferocity. 2 more shadow wolves dissolved under his relentless attacks, their forms scattered like ash in a gale. But for every creature he destroyed, another materialized through the castle walls, drawn by the intoxicating scent of Lily's awakening power. Behind him he could hear her voice, not screaming but chanting something in a language he didn't recognize, words that seemed to pull themselves from genetic memory rather than conscious knowledge. The air around her crackled with energy that made his transformed senses sing with warning. "Stop," he wanted to roar, but his shifted throat could only produce growls. Whatever she was attempting would only draw more predators, would mark her location for every supernatural hunter within 100 miles. The shadow wolves sensed it too. Their attack pattern changed, becoming more desperate, more coordinated. They pressed their assault not to kill him, but to get past him, to reach the source of power that called to them like a beacon in the magical wasteland of Valdoria. Marcus fought with everything he had, but he was one against many, and they were no ordinary opponents. These creatures existed partially outside physical reality, able to phase through his strikes when it suited them while maintaining just enough substance to tear at his flesh with burning claws. A wolf slipped past his guard, materializing directly behind him. Marcus spun, but knew with sick certainty that he would be too late. The creature's jaws gaped wide as it dove toward Lily's small form. The child's chanting reached a crescendo, and power exploded outward from her like a shock wave. The shadow wolf struck an invisible barrier 3 feet from Lily and rebounded as if hitting solid stone. But the magical backlash was too much for her untrained abilities to contain. The protective shield she had instinctively created shattered like glass, and the feedback sent her small body flying backward into the stone wall with a sickening crack. Lily. Marcus's anguished roar filled the hall as his human consciousness reasserted itself. The child lay motionless where she had fallen, blood trickling from her temple, her face pale as winter snow. In that moment of distraction, the shadow wolves struck. Pain erupted through Marcus's side as ethereal claws found purchase between his ribs, ice-cold agony that felt like being stabbed with frozen lightning. Another wolf materialized directly beneath him, its jaws clamping down on his leg with supernatural strength. The physical pain was nothing compared to the terror that consumed him as more wolves poured through the walls, no longer hindered by Lily's protective magic. They swarmed him, a writhing mass of shadow and hunger that drove him to his knees despite his enhanced strength. Each wound they inflicted burned with otherworldly cold that sapped his power, their claws leaving traces of shadow poison that spread through his system like liquid darkness. "My lord!" Edmund's cry came from across the hall, but the old steward was fighting his own desperate battle against 2 wolves that had cornered him near the throne. His sword passed through them harmlessly when they chose to phase, while their solid claws left bloody furrows in his arms. Marcus tried to reach Lily, driven by paternal instincts that had awakened too late. But the shadow wolves sensed his desperation and used it against him, forming a living barrier between him and the unconscious child. Each step toward her cost him dearly, his strength ebbing as their poison worked deeper into his system. The great hall's ancient stones began to crack under the pressure of supernatural forces, centuries-old masonry groaning as reality itself bent around the magical battle. Tapestries burst into flame from the residual energy of Lily's shattered spell, and the very air tasted of ozone and despair. Through the haze of pain and poison, Marcus watched in helpless horror as more shadow wolves converged on Lily's still form. Her magical outburst had marked her as something precious, powerful, exactly the kind of prize their kind existed to claim. They circled her unconscious body like vultures, testing the air for any remaining traces of her protective magic. Finding none, Marcus made one final, desperate lunge toward her, but his legs gave out completely. The shadow poison had reached his heart, that treacherous organ that had only recently learned to beat again. Each pulse sent ice through his veins, slowing his movements until even drawing breath became a monumental effort. As consciousness began to slip away, the last thing he saw was a shadow wolf solidifying fully, its jaws opening wide as it bent toward Lily's defenseless form. He had failed her. After 2 centuries of emotional isolation, after finally finding something worth protecting, his cursed nature had proven insufficient when it mattered most. The Alpha King closed his eyes as darkness claimed him, the sound of Lily's shallow breathing fading into terrible silence. The silence that followed should have been death. Marcus had resigned himself to that truth as the shadow poison dragged him into oblivion, had accepted that his last act would be witness to Lily's destruction. But consciousness returned with jarring suddenness, accompanied by a sound that made no sense in the context of their defeat. Singing. Lily's voice, clear and impossibly strong, filled the great hall with a melody that seemed to reshape reality itself. But this was not the desperate chanting of an untrained child. This was something ancient, primal, sung in harmonies that human vocal cords should never have been able to produce. Marcus forced his eyes open, expecting to find himself in whatever afterlife awaited cursed kings. Instead, he saw Lily standing in the center of the hall, surrounded by a nimbus of silver light that pulsed in rhythm with her song. The shadow wolves lay motionless around her feet, not destroyed but somehow pacified, their ethereal forms flickering like dying embers. But it was Lily herself who stole his breath. Gone was the frightened 7-year-old who had collapsed at his gates. The child before him moved with otherworldly grace, her green eyes now blazing with power that seemed older than the castle stones themselves. As she sang, the silver light emanating from her skin began to take shape, the ghostly outline of massive wings that spread behind her like a benediction. "Impossible," Marcus whispered, the word scraping his throat raw. Edmund's voice came from somewhere to his left, filled with awe and terror in equal measure. "She's not Blackthorn." The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. The bloodline that had cursed him, the family whose betrayal had frozen his heart for 2 centuries. Lily bore their scent because she had been among them, not because she belonged to them. Her true heritage was something else entirely, something that made the shadow wolves cower and the very air sing with suppressed divinity. "She's Seraphim," Marcus breathed, pieces of impossible truth finally clicking into place. The singing stopped. Lily turned toward him, and for a moment her eyes held depths that seemed to encompass eternity. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that resonated in his bones. "I remember now." The silver light around her began to fade, and with it the otherworldly presence that had commanded the hall. The shadow wolves stirred, no longer held by whatever power she had wielded, but they made no move to attack. Instead, they backed toward the walls with something resembling reverence, their forms growing more translucent with each step. "My parents," Lily continued, her voice returning to that of a child, but retaining an underlying strength that had not been there before. "They didn't abandon me, they died protecting me from those who would use what I am." Marcus struggled to sit up, his wounds still burning, but no longer spreading their poison through his system. The shadow wolves' retreat had lifted their supernatural toxin from his blood. "Lily." "The Blackthorns found me after," she said, walking toward him with steps that seemed to leave brief impressions of light on the stone floor. "They thought I was one of their lost children. They took me in, but I always knew I didn't belong." The last of the shadow wolves faded through the walls, their hunt abandoned in the face of prey that had proven to be predator instead. The great hall fell into stunned silence, broken only by the crackle of flames consuming the ruined tapestries. "A seraphim child," Edmund said wonderingly. "I thought they were legend." "As did I," Marcus admitted, finally managing to stand despite his injuries. Everything about the past 3 days suddenly made terrible, perfect sense. Lily's uncanny ability to read his emotions, her lack of fear in the face of his transformed state, the way his cursed heart had begun beating again in her presence. It was not coincidence or simple human connection. It was divine intervention. "That's why the curse is breaking," he said, the words carrying the weight of revelation. "Not because you're innocent, but because you're—" "What I am doesn't matter," Lily interrupted, her green eyes meeting his with startling intensity. "What matters is that you saved me when no one else would. You gave me a home when I was lost and afraid. That's not magic or destiny or divine will, that's just you choosing to be kind." The simplicity of her words cut through 2 centuries of bitterness and self-recrimination. Marcus had spent so long believing himself irredeemable, so certain that his cursed nature precluded any possibility of genuine connection, that he had missed the most fundamental truth of all. Redemption had never been about deserving it. The Alpha King looked at this impossible child, part angel, part lost little girl, wholly his, and felt the last walls around his heart finally crumble. "You're not going anywhere," he said quietly. Lily smiled, and for a moment her face seemed to glow with inner light. "I know." Outside, dawn was beginning to break over Valdoria. For the first time in 200 years, it did not feel like winter. Marcus stood in the ruins of his great hall as the first true dawn in centuries painted the stone walls gold. The shadow wolves were gone, the immediate threat vanquished, but their attack had accomplished something far more dangerous than mere violence. It had announced Lily's presence to every supernatural entity within 1,000 miles. "We cannot stay here," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 200 years' experience in supernatural warfare. "The wolves were scouts. Others will come." Edmund nodded grimly as he surveyed the damage. Cracked stones, scorched tapestries, and the lingering scent of otherworldly magic would take months to repair. The old sanctuaries in the northern peaks might offer temporary refuge, but they've been abandoned for decades. "No." Lily's voice was soft, but carried an authority that made both men turn. "Running won't solve anything. They'll keep hunting us, and innocent people will be hurt." She moved to one of the shattered windows, her small frame silhouetted against the growing light. "Besides, I'm tired of hiding." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, not the curse breaking, but something deeper. The protective instincts that had awakened with Lily's arrival were evolving, transforming from desperate guardianship into something more strategic. She was right. Flight would only delay the inevitable while putting others at risk. "When we make our stand here," he said, the decision crystallizing with surprising clarity, "but not as refugees hiding behind castle walls. We gather allies. We prepare for war." Edmund's weathered face creased with concern. "My lord, who would stand with us? The neighboring kingdoms have barely acknowledged your existence for decades, and now, with the child's nature revealed—" "The seraphim were not always solitary beings," Marcus said, pieces of ancient lore surfacing from his extensive memory. "They had guardians, protectors among the mortal races, bloodlines bound by oaths that transcend death itself." Lily turned from the window, hope flickering in her green eyes. "You think some might still honor those bonds?" "I think desperation has a way of awakening dormant loyalties," Marcus replied. "The shadow wolves' presence here means the barriers between realms are weakening. Other kingdoms will soon face threats they cannot comprehend, let alone combat. They will need someone who understands the supernatural world." The Alpha King began to pace, his strategic mind already mapping possibilities. The Ravencrest clan in the Eastern Territories, they've always maintained a grudging respect for the old ways, and the mountain tribes beyond the Thornwall have their own reasons to fear what lurks in the spaces between worlds. "That's assuming they'll trust a cursed king and a seraphim child," Edmund pointed out pragmatically. "Trust will have to be earned," Marcus acknowledged. "But first, we secure our immediate defenses. The castle's warding stones were cracked but not destroyed. If we can repair them, strengthen them with—" He glanced at Lily. "With your abilities properly channeled, we might create a sanctuary that could withstand a siege." Lily nodded slowly. "I can feel them, the old protections built into this place. They're not broken, just sleeping." She pressed her palm against the nearest wall, and for a moment, silver light traced the ancient carved patterns hidden beneath centuries of accumulated grime. "I think I can wake them up." The sight sent a thrill of possibility through Marcus. Here was power he had never dared dream of commanding, not through dominance or fear, but through genuine partnership. "We'll need supplies, weapons enchanted to harm ethereal beings, and information." His expression darkened. "Someone sent those wolves. This was not a random hunt." "The Blackthorns," Edmund suggested grimly. "Perhaps, or someone who learned of Lily's location from them." Marcus moved to the great hearth, where ashes from last night's fire still glowed faintly. "Edmund, prepare messages for the Ravencrest clan and the mountain chieftains, offer them alliance against the coming darkness, and proof of the supernatural threats they will face whether they acknowledge them or not. And if they refuse, then we face what comes alone." Marcus turned back to Lily, who was still tracing the hidden patterns in the stone. Light followed her fingers now, growing stronger with each pass. "But I do not think we will be alone. Word will spread of what happened here. Stories have power in the supernatural realm. and the story of a cursed king and a seraphim child standing against the darkness will draw both enemies and allies. Lily's hand found his, small fingers intertwining with his scarred ones. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said simply. Marcus looked down at her, this impossible child who had shattered his curse and awakened possibilities he had thought buried forever, and felt something new kindling in his chest. Not just hope, but determination forged in purpose greater than survival. "Neither am I," he realized, and meant it. For the first time in 2 centuries, the Alpha King was no longer merely enduring. He was preparing to fight for something worth protecting. Outside, Valdoria stirred to life under a sun that no longer felt cold. The warmth of sunlight streaming through the castle's damaged windows felt like a promise. But Marcus knew promises could be broken as easily as made. He squeezed Lily's hand once before releasing it, the simple gesture anchoring him to this moment, this choice, before the weight of what lay ahead could steel his resolve. "Edmund, how long before those messages can reach the Raven Crest territory?" 3 days by our fastest riders, assuming the mountain passes haven't been blocked by fresh snowfall." The old steward's practical tone couldn't quite mask his underlying concern. "My lord, are you certain this is wise? Revealing our position to potential allies also reveals it to our enemies." Marcus moved to the great table where maps of Valdoria had gathered dust for decades. His finger traced the mountain routes, calculating distances and dangers with the precision of someone who had once commanded armies. "Our enemies already know where we are. The question is whether we can gather strength before they gather theirs." Lily approached the table, having to stand on her toes to see the carefully drawn borders and geographical features. "These symbols here," she said, pointing to small marks scattered across the map. "What do they mean?" "Old shrine sites," Marcus explained. "Places where the barrier between realms was once maintained by priests and guardians. Most have been abandoned for generations, but if even a few retain their power, I could restore them," Lily said quietly. "I think, if someone could take me to them." The casual way she spoke of wielding divine power to reshape magical defenses across an entire kingdom should have been absurd. Instead, Marcus found himself calculating how such an undertaking might be accomplished. It would be dangerous. Days of travel through territory we cannot fully secure, with you exposed and vulnerable. "I'm already exposed and vulnerable," she pointed out with disconcerting logic. "At least this way, I'd be doing something useful instead of just hiding and hoping." Edmund cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should focus on immediate fortifications first. The castle's defenses could be strengthened before we consider broader initiatives." Marcus nodded, though part of him rebelled against the delay. Every hour they spent in preparation was another hour for their enemies to organize, to plan, to strike. But rushing headlong into battle with insufficient preparation had been the mistake that cost him his mate, his kingdom, his very humanity 2 centuries ago. He would not repeat that error with Lily's life at stake. "Show me," he said to Lily. "Show me how the castle's protections can be restored." She led them through corridors Marcus had walked for decades without truly seeing, her small fingers tracing patterns that became visible only under her touch. Ancient runes emerged from seemingly blank stone, following ley lines that connected the castle's foundations to sources of power buried deep in Valdoria's bedrock. "The builders knew," she murmured, as silver light revealed inscriptions in languages that predated human settlement. "They built this place on a convergence point, where natural magic flows strongest. But the connections have been neglected." Marcus watched her work with a mixture of awe and growing unease. Each revelation of her true nature drove home how little he understood about what she was capable of becoming. "Lily, when you restore these protections, will others be able to sense it? Will it draw more attacks?" She paused, her hand resting on a particularly complex symbol that seemed to pulse with dormant energy. "Yes," she said honestly, "but it will also send a message that we're not helpless, that we're ready to fight back." That could be seen as a declaration of war. Good. The steel in her young voice reminded him that for all her childlike appearance, she carried the essence of beings who had once stood as heaven's warriors. They started this war the moment they decided I was something to be hunted. Now they'll learn what it means to face someone who refuses to be prey. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The frightened little girl who had begged for leftovers at his gates was still there, but she was no longer alone in her own skin. Something ancient and terrible and magnificent looked out through her green eyes, weighing the world and finding it wanting. Marcus felt the familiar chill of approaching conflict, but also something else, anticipation. For 200 years he had been a predator without purpose, cursed strength turned inward in endless self-recrimination. Now, finally, he had a cause worth the monster he had become. "Then we prepare for war," he said simply. "Edmund, send the messages. Include warnings about what they'll face if they refuse our alliance. Lily, begin with the castle's primary ward stones. I'll gather what weapons we have and determine what else we'll need." As they dispersed to their tasks, Marcus caught his reflection in a damaged mirror hanging askew in the corridor. The face that looked back was no longer that of a cursed hermit waiting for death. It was the face of a king preparing to reclaim his throne and defend something more precious than any crown. The final confrontation was coming. This time, he would be ready. The first sign that their enemies had arrived came not as sound or sight, but as a wrongness in the air itself. Marcus felt it while inspecting the armory, a sudden chill that had nothing to do with Valdoria's eternal winter, and everything to do with the presence of beings that should not exist in the mortal realm. His enhanced senses, sharpened by 2 centuries of supernatural awareness, detected the approach of something vast and malevolent, moving through the forest beyond his gates. "Edmund!" His voice carried the unmistakable authority of a king preparing for battle. "Sound the alarm! They're here!" The old steward's face paled, but his movements remained steady as he pulled the ancient bell rope. The bronze toll that echoed through the castle's corridors had not been heard for decades, a sound that once called armies to war, now summoning a handful of servants and one impossible child to make their final stand. Lily appeared in the armory doorway before the bell's echoes faded, silver light already beginning to gather around her small form. The past 3 days of preparation had changed her in ways that went beyond her awakened divine nature. Gone was the uncertainty that had marked her first attempts to channel her power. In its place was a focused determination that reminded Marcus powerfully of warriors he had known in ages past. "How many?" she asked, moving to the window that overlooked the castle's main approach. Marcus joined her, his enhanced vision cutting through the pre-dawn darkness to survey the force arrayed against them. What he saw made his blood run cold. "Too many," he said grimly. The enemy had not come as a rabble of shadow wolves or desperate scavengers. This was an army in the truest sense, dozens of ethereal forms moving with military precision through the trees, their translucent bodies flickering between visible and invisible as they maintained formation. At their head walked figures that retained more substantial form, beings powerful enough to anchor themselves fully in the mortal realm. "Fallen seraphim," Lily whispered, and Marcus heard both recognition and grief in her voice. "They've allied with the Shadow Lords." "Can you face them?" Marcus asked, though part of him recoiled at the necessity of the question. She was still a child, regardless of her divine heritage. The part of him that had awakened to fatherhood over these past days screamed in protest at the idea of allowing her to step into such danger. "I have to," she replied simply. "This is what I was born for, Marcus, not just to break your curse, to stand against the darkness when it tries to consume the light." Edmund appeared at Marcus's shoulder, carrying weapons from their hastily assembled arsenal. "The ward stones are holding, but they won't stop a force this size for long. Whatever we're going to do—" His words were cut off by a sound that made the castle's ancient stones tremble, a voice that carried across the distance with supernatural clarity, speaking in harmonics that resonated in the listener's bones. "Marcus Thorn, "Cursed king of a forgotten realm," the voice called. "Surrender the child, and your death will be swift. Continue to shelter her, and we will take her over your screaming corpse and the ashes of everything you have ever protected." Marcus felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had sustained him through 2 centuries of exile, now focused and given purpose by something worth defending. "Let them come," he growled, accepting the enchanted blade Edmund offered. "They want to take her? They'll have to go through me." But even as he spoke the words, Marcus knew that rage alone would not be enough. The enemies gathering beyond his walls were not the desperate scavengers or mindless predators he had faced in past decades. These were beings of immense power, fallen angels who had retained their divine might while abandoning their celestial purpose. Brute force would not win this battle. Lily's hand found his arm, her touch carrying the same silver light that had restored the castle's ancient protections. "Not through you," she corrected gently. "With you. Together." The distinction carried weight that transformed Marcus's understanding of the coming battle. For 200 years he had fought alone, strength without strategy, power without purpose. But Lily was offering something he had not experienced since his mortal days as a true king: partnership, not the desperate protection of the weak by the strong, but the alliance of 2 forces working in harmony toward a shared goal. Together he agreed, and felt something shift in the air around them, not just the curse continuing to break, but something new being forged in its place. The enemy army had reached the outer walls. Through the window, Marcus could see the first of the ethereal soldiers testing the boundaries of the restored ward stones, their forms flickering as divine energy repelled their advance. But the wards were already showing strain, silver light fluctuating as overwhelming force pressed against ancient protections. "They're testing our defenses," Edmund observed unnecessarily. Marcus gripped his weapon tighter, feeling the familiar weight of enchanted steel in his palm. "Then let's show them what we're truly capable of defending." The final test had begun. The first ward stone shattered with a sound like breaking starlight. Marcus felt the protective barriers collapse like a physical blow, the ancient magic that had shielded his castle for 3 days, dissolving into motes of silver that scattered on the wind. Through the breach poured ethereal soldiers, their translucent forms gaining terrible solidity as they crossed into the mortal realm. "The courtyard," he commanded, pulling Lily back from the window as something that might once have been an angel landed on the sill outside, its wings now tattered shadows trailing darkness. "We make our stand in the courtyard. More room to maneuver, and the secondary ward circle is strongest there." They raced through corridors that echoed with the sound of breaking glass and splintering wood as the enemy force pressed their assault. Edmund moved with surprising speed for his age, clutching a crossbow loaded with bolts blessed by priests long dead. Behind them, inhuman voices called out in harmonics that made the castle stones weep. The courtyard's ancient flagstones blazed with silver light as they emerged into the pre-dawn air. Lily had activated the secondary protections, and the space thrummed with defensive power, but Marcus could see fractures already spreading through the magical barrier as darker forces hammered against it from all sides. "There," Lily said, pointing to the courtyard's center where an ornate fountain had run dry decades ago. "The convergence point. If I can reach it, channel the ley lines properly." A sound like thunder split the air, and one of the fallen seraphim descended from the sky to land on the courtyard's outer edge. Where mortal angels might have been beautiful, this creature was magnificent in its corruption. Wings of tattered starlight, eyes like dying suns, a face that held echoes of divine perfection twisted by eons of malice. "The child comes with us, cursed king," it spoke, voice carrying harmonics that turned the air itself into a weapon. "Her power belongs with those who understand its true purpose." Marcus stepped forward, placing himself between Lily and the fallen angel, his enchanted blade humming with protective magic. "Her power belongs to her, something you abandoned when you chose darkness over duty." The creature's laugh was like the sound of stars burning out. "Duty? To what?" mortals who fear us, a creation that cowers from its makers, its gaze fixed on Lily with predatory hunger. You carry the essence of what we once were, child. Join us and reclaim the dominion that is your birthright. I know what you are, Lily said quietly, silver light beginning to gather around her small form. You're what happens when power becomes more important than purpose, when strength forgets mercy. More enemies poured through the broken ward stones, shadow wolves, lesser fallen beings, creatures of pure malevolence drawn by the promise of consuming divine essence. The courtyard filled with supernatural threats, but Marcus found his attention locked on the fallen seraph. This was their true enemy, the force directing this assault. Defeat it, and the others would scatter. Edmund, get to the fountain, Marcus commanded. Clear Lily's path. The old steward nodded grimly, raising his crossbow as shadow wolves bounded toward them. His first shot took one creature in the chest, blessed steel unmaking its dark form in a burst of dissipating shadow. But more pressed forward, and Marcus knew Edmund couldn't hold them all. With a roar that carried 2 centuries of frustrated rage finally given proper target, Marcus launched himself into the enemy ranks. His blade carved through shadow and corrupted flesh with supernatural precision, each strike guided by instincts honed in 1,000 battles. He was no longer fighting for survival or abstract principles. He fought to protect the one innocent soul who had seen past his monstrous exterior to the man he could still choose to be. Behind him, Lily ran for the fountain, silver light blazing brighter with each step. The fallen seraph moved to intercept her, massive wings spreading to block her path, but Marcus spun and hurled his blade with inhuman strength. The enchanted steel struck the creature's wing, drawing a scream that shattered windows throughout the castle. "Now!" he shouted. Lily reached the fountain and pressed both hands against the ancient stone convergence point. Light exploded outward, not the gentle silver glow she had used to heal his curse, but something far more primal and terrible. This was the power that had once stood guard at the gates of paradise, now awakened in defense of something precious. The fallen seraph recovered, turning toward her with murder in its dying star eyes. If we cannot have her, then no one shall. It raised one clawed hand, dark energy gathering to strike down the child whose only crime had been asking for leftovers. But Marcus was already moving, throwing himself between them as corrupted divine power lashed out. Pain beyond description tore through him, not just physical agony, but spiritual rending that threatened to unmake his very soul. Yet somehow, impossibly, he remained standing. The love that had grown in his cursed heart, the protective bond forged with an impossible child, proved stronger than the darkness trying to destroy him. "Together," Lily whispered, and Marcus felt her power flow through him, transforming his curse into something new, not redemption, but purpose given form. Together, they faced the darkness, and together, they prepared to win. The divine power flowing through Marcus was nothing like the curse that had sustained him for 2 centuries. Where the dark magic had been cold and isolating, this light burned with warmth that touched the deepest parts of his soul. But with it came terrible understanding, the cost of what they were about to do. "Lily," he said, his voice strained as corrupted divine energy continued to tear at him. "The convergence point. If you channel this much power through it, it will burn out, the ley lines will collapse." Her small hands pressed harder against the ancient stone, silver light streaming between her fingers. "I know," she whispered, and he heard the tears she was trying to hide. "But it's the only way to stop them all at once, the only way to make sure they can never hunt another child like me." Marcus felt his heart, the heart she had awakened, break a little. The convergence point wasn't just the source of the castle's power, it was what had allowed her divine essence to manifest safely in the mortal realm, what had let her exist as both angel and child. Destroying it would sever that connection forever. "You'll lose yourself," he said desperately. "The mortal part of you, the little girl who asked for leftovers." "She'll always be part of me," Lily said, and her voice was changing, gaining harmonics that resonated with celestial authority. "But she can't stay, not if I'm going to do what needs to be done." The fallen seraph gathered itself for another strike, its corrupted form radiating malevolence. Around them, the courtyard filled with more enemies as shadow wolves and lesser demons poured through the broken defenses. Edmund's crossbow had fallen silent. Marcus could see the old steward pressed against the fountain's base, bleeding from claw marks, but still protecting Lily's flank. "There has to be another way," Marcus said, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew there wasn't. He had lived long enough to recognize the moment when all choices narrowed to a single terrible path. "There is," Lily said, turning to look at him with eyes that now blazed with silver fire. "You could let me go, keep your castle, your curse, your solitude. Save yourself." The suggestion hit him like a physical blow. After 2 centuries of isolation, the idea of returning to that empty existence was unbearable. But worse was the thought of failing to protect the one person who had shown him he could still choose to be more than his curse. "Never," he said fiercely. "We finish this together." Lily smiled, the last purely childlike expression he would see from her, and nodded. "Together, then." She turned back to the convergence point and began to sing. The melody was wordless, but carried meaning that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the soul. It was the song of creation's first dawn, of light driving back primordial darkness, of hope refusing to surrender to despair. The silver radiance around her intensified until it became difficult to look at directly. Marcus felt the power building, felt the ley lines beneath the castle beginning to resonate with energies not meant for the mortal realm. The fallen seraph screamed in rage and launched itself forward, claws extended to tear them both apart. This time, Marcus didn't need weapons. The divine light flowing through him had transformed his curse into something new, not redemption, but purpose crystallized into unbreakable will. He caught the creature's strike barehanded, supernatural strength meeting corrupted divinity in a clash that sent shockwaves through the courtyard. "You don't understand," the fallen being snarled, pressing forward with malevolent force. "She is the last of her kind. When she burns herself out stopping us, there will be no more guardians, no more protection against the darkness we serve." "Then we'll have to be enough," Marcus said, and drove his fist through the creature's chest. The seraph dissolved into screaming shadows, its destruction sending ripples of terror through the lesser enemies. But Marcus barely noticed their retreat. His attention was fixed on Lily as her song reached crescendo, as power beyond mortal comprehension gathered around the ancient convergence point. "I won't forget," he promised her desperately. "The little girl who changed everything, I'll remember her." "Good," she said, though her voice now carried harmonics that made the air itself sing. "Because she'll remember you too, always." The convergence point exploded with light that turned night to day, that sent cleansing fire racing along ley lines throughout Valdoria, that reached out to touch every place where darkness had thought itself safe. Marcus felt the enemy army unmade in an instant, their corrupted forms unable to withstand the purifying radiance. When the light faded, the courtyard was empty except for Marcus, Edmund, and the figure at the fountain's center. She still looked like Lily, but the childlike innocence was gone, replaced by something timeless and magnificent and infinitely sad. The last guardian had awakened, and Marcus finally understood the true cost of their victory. The silence that followed was unlike anything Marcus had experienced in 3 centuries of existence. It wasn't the hollow quiet of his cursed solitude. This was the profound stillness that comes after transformation, when the world holds its breath to acknowledge that something fundamental has changed forever. Lily, or the being she had become, stood motionless at the ruined convergence point, silver light still flickering around her form like dying embers. The ancient fountain had cracked down its center, the magical focal point that had anchored the castle's power for millennia, now nothing more than broken stone. Yet somehow she remained, though Marcus could sense the terrible fragility in her continued presence. "Is it over?" Edmund's voice cracked as he struggled to his feet, one hand pressed against the claw wounds on his ribs. Blood seeped between his fingers, but his eyes were fixed on the transformed child with something between awe and heartbreak. Marcus surveyed the empty courtyard, his supernatural senses reaching out to probe for any lingering threats. The ward stones lay in shattered fragments, their protective magic spent. The castle walls bore scars from ethereal claws and shadow fire. But beyond the immediate destruction, he felt something else, a fundamental shift in the spiritual landscape of Valdoria itself. "The ley lines," he said quietly. "They're not just broken here. The cleansing fire traveled along every magical conduit in the kingdom, every nest of shadow creatures, every corrupted shrine, every place where darkness had taken root." He paused, understanding dawning. She didn't just destroy the army. She purified the entire realm. The being who had been Lily turned toward them, and Marcus's breath caught. Her face was the same, the delicate features, the dark hair now touched with silver at the temples, but her eyes held depths that spoke of eons rather than years. When she moved, it was with the fluid grace of something no longer entirely bound by mortal limitations. "The darkness is gone," she confirmed, her voice carrying harmonics that made the broken stones around them resonate softly. "Not just driven back, but cleansed from this realm entirely. It will be centuries before the corrupted ones can establish another foothold here." Marcus felt a complex mix of triumph and loss wash over him. They had won, saved not just themselves but an entire kingdom from supernatural predation. Yet the price stared back at him with eyes that still held traces of the little girl who had collapsed at his gates, asking for leftovers. "And you?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "What happens to you now?" She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant as if seeing things beyond mortal perception. "I remain but changed. The convergence point that allowed me to exist as both mortal and divine is destroyed. I can no longer be the child I was." Edmund made a small sound of protest, but she continued gently. "Don't grieve for her. She served her purpose, not just breaking Marcus's curse, but teaching all of us that love can transform even the deepest darkness. That legacy will endure." Marcus stepped closer, his heart aching with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. "Do you still remember? Being 7 years old, being hungry, being afraid?" A smile touched her transformed features, the first expression that reminded him of the child she had been. "I remember everything. The taste of your stew, the warmth of sleeping by the fire, the way you looked at me like I was precious rather than powerful." The smile deepened. "Those memories are what keep me anchored to this form, to this place. Without them, I would simply ascend." The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. She was choosing to remain, choosing to maintain some connection to mortality rather than return to whatever celestial realm awaited her. And that choice was tethered to their shared experiences, to the bond forged during those few precious days when she had simply been a lost child in need of protection. "But you can't stay as you were," he said, understanding flooding through him. "You're something else now, something greater." "A guardian," she confirmed, "the last one, tasked with watching over this realm from threats both within and without. It's what I was always meant to become. I just needed to learn what was worth guarding first." Edmund cleared his throat softly. "And us? The castle, the kingdom, what becomes of what you protected?" Marcus felt the answer before she spoke it, a certainty that settled into his bones like truth finally acknowledged. His curse was broken, had been shattered completely when divine light flowed through him. The unnatural preservation that had sustained him for 2 centuries was gone, replaced by something far more valuable, a purpose that didn't require dark magic to maintain. "That choice belongs to you," she said, looking directly at Marcus. "You're no longer the cursed Alpha King, you're simply Marcus Thorn, a man with centuries of experience and the freedom to decide what kind of legacy he wants to leave." As dawn broke properly over Valdoria for the first time in generations, natural sunlight unmarred by supernatural shadow, Marcus felt the weight of infinite possibility settle around him. The child who had asked for leftovers had given him something beyond redemption. She had given him hope. Marcus stood in the courtyard as dawn light revealed the full extent of their transformation. The broken ward stones, the shattered convergence point, the scorch marks from divine fire all bore witness to the night that had changed everything. But it was the absence that struck him most profoundly. No supernatural cold bit at his skin, no curse-born restlessness gnawed at his soul. For the first time in 2 centuries, he felt simply human. "Edmund," he said quietly, "how long since you've seen the kingdom beyond these walls?" The old steward blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Not since the curse took hold, my lord. The roads were too dangerous, the villages too far from the castle's protection." Marcus nodded, understanding flooding through him. They had all become prisoners of necessity, guardians trapped by the very evil they held at bay. But if the darkness was truly gone, if the realm was cleansed, then it's time we returned to the world, he decided. Time we remembered what we've been protecting all these years. The guardian who had been Lily watched him with those impossibly deep eyes. "You're thinking of leaving the castle?" "I'm thinking of living," Marcus replied. "Really living, instead of just existing." He gestured to the broken fortifications around them. "This place has served its purpose. It was a sanctuary when one was needed, a fortress against the dark. But Valdoria needs more than hidden guardians now. It needs rebuilding." Edmund's weathered face creased with worry. "My lord, the people, after 2 centuries, they may not remember the Thorn name kindly, the stories they tell of the cursed Alpha King." Marcus felt a wry smile touch his lips. "Then we'll give them new stories, better ones." He turned to study the damaged castle that had been his prison and refuge. "This place will always be here if sanctuary is needed again. But I think it's time to walk among the people we've protected from the shadows." The guardian nodded slowly. "A wise choice. The realm will need leaders who understand both the darkness that threatens it and the light that can drive it back." "And you?" Marcus asked. "Will you remain here?" She was quiet for a long moment, her attention turning inward. When she spoke, her voice carried both sadness and resolve. "I'll watch from afar. The old ways, the hidden guardian in the deep places. That role is mine now. But knowing you're out there, living the life the little girl helped you find, that will anchor me to what I'm protecting." Edmund cleared his throat. "If I may, my lord, where would we even begin? The villages, the trade routes, the connections between communities. It's all been severed by centuries of fear." Marcus considered this, feeling the weight of responsibility settle around him like a familiar cloak. But unlike the burden of his curse, this felt purposeful, chosen. "We start small," he said. "Find the nearest village, see what they need. Food, protection, trade connections, problems we can solve." He paused, remembering. "Help them the way we would want to be helped, if we were the ones asking for leftovers." The guardian's smile was radiant. "She would be so proud to hear you say that." "She is proud," Marcus corrected gently, "because she's still part of you, just as that scared, angry man I used to be is still part of me. We're all of our choices, aren't we? The dark ones and the light." As the morning progressed, they began to prepare. Edmund packed supplies with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades managing a supernatural household. Marcus selected practical clothing, simple tunics and sturdy boots, rather than the elaborate garments befitting a cursed king. Most tellingly, he left his enchanted blade hanging in the great hall. "You're not taking it?" Edmund asked, surprised. Marcus shook his head. "That sword was forged for war against darkness. If I'm right about what we've accomplished, I won't need it where we're going." He paused at the castle's main entrance, looking back one final time. "And if I'm wrong, well, a man should have faith in more than just his weapons." The guardian appeared beside them as they prepared to leave, her form somehow both solid and ephemeral in the morning light. "Before you go," she said softly, and pressed something into Marcus's hand. He looked down to find a small wooden carving, a wolf and a little girl sitting by a fire, whittled with careful detail. "When did you—" "The night before the attack," she said. when I still had hands small enough for such work. I wanted you to have something to remember, not the guardian I became, but the child who chose to trust you." Marcus's throat tightened as he tucked the carving carefully into his pack. "Thank you for everything." As they walked through the castle gates that had once seemed like the boundary of the world, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since before his curse: anticipation for the future. Behind them, the Guardian watched from the highest tower, a silver figure against the morning sky. Ahead lay roads untraveled, villages unvisited, people who would need the kind of help that came not from divine power or ancient magic, but from simple human compassion. The Alpha King was gone. Marcus Thorne had come home to a world he was finally free to serve. The first village they encountered lay 3 days' walk from the castle, nestled in a valley where smoke rose from chimneys and children's laughter carried on the wind. Marcus paused at the crest of the hill overlooking it, struck by how normal it all seemed, how vibrantly, wonderfully ordinary after centuries of supernatural dread. "Millbrook," Edmund said softly, consulting a map whose edges had yellowed with age. According to this, they were known for their grain mills before everything changed. Marcus could see the skeletal remains of water wheels along the stream that gave the village its name, their wooden bones picked clean by decades of neglect. But smoke still rose from perhaps 24 homes, and he could make out figures moving between buildings with the purposeful rhythm of a community that had learned to survive. "They'll be afraid," he said, more to himself than to Edmund. "Strangers arriving without warning, especially ones who might carry the scent of magic." "Perhaps," Edmund agreed, "but they'll also be curious. It's been a long time since anyone traveled these roads freely." They descended the hill slowly, making no effort to conceal their approach. Marcus had discarded any pretense of supernatural authority. His clothing was simple, his manner deliberately unthreatening. Yet he couldn't quite suppress the way his senses automatically catalogued defensive positions, escape routes, potential threats. 2 centuries of vigilance couldn't be shed overnight. The first person to notice them was a woman hanging laundry behind a cottage near the village outskirts. She froze when she spotted them, clothespins forgotten in her hands, then disappeared inside with urgent haste. By the time they reached the village proper, a small crowd had gathered in the central square, wary faces peering from doorways and windows. "Good morning," Marcus called out, stopping a respectful distance away. "We're travelers seeking news of the roads ahead, and perhaps a meal if you can spare it." An older man with a blacksmith's build stepped forward, his expression guarded but not hostile. "Been a long time since we've seen travelers," he said. "Where are you coming from?" "The northern mountains," Marcus replied truthfully. "We heard the dark times might be ending, thought we'd see for ourselves what the world looked like in the light." A murmur ran through the gathered villagers. A woman with prematurely grey hair spoke up from the crowd. "Dark times ending? What makes you think that?" Marcus considered his words carefully. How did one explain that ancient evils had been purged by divine fire without sounding like a madman? "Have you noticed a change in recent days? Less fear in the shadows, perhaps? Animals returning to places they'd avoided?" The blacksmith's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Now that you mention it, my boy said he saw deer drinking from the old creek yesterday. Haven't seen game there in 20 years. He paused. "And the nightmares. Used to wake up screaming every few nights, the whole village did. But the last week or so, they've stopped," the grey-haired woman finished. "We thought it was just coincidence." "Maybe it was," Marcus said gently, "or maybe the world really is healing. Either way, we're here to help if we can. I have some experience with building and metalwork. My friend here knows trade routes and bookkeeping." Over the following hours, suspicion gradually gave way to cautious welcome. They shared a simple lunch of bread and vegetable soup, Marcus's heart clenching at the unconscious echo of that first meal with Lily, and listened to the villagers' stories, tales of isolation, of making do with broken tools and failing infrastructure, of children who had never traveled beyond the valley because the roads were too dangerous. But also stories of resilience, of neighbors helping neighbors, of small joys carved from hard circumstances. These people had endured, had built something worth protecting in the face of supernatural dread. By evening, Marcus found himself helping repair the water wheel mechanism while Edmund reviewed the village's trade records by lamplight. The work felt good, purposeful in a way that had nothing to do with curses or prophecies, just one person helping another solve a practical problem. "You know," the blacksmith said as they tested the repaired wheel, "you remind me of someone. Can't place who, but there's something familiar about you." Marcus smiled, watching water flow smoothly through the restored channels. "Maybe I just have one of those faces." As night fell, they were offered shelter in the village inn, a modest building that had seen better days but radiated warmth and hospitality. Marcus lay awake long into the night, listening to the peaceful sounds of a community at rest. No supernatural cold gnawed at his bones. No cursed restlessness drove him to patrol empty halls. Instead, he felt something he had almost forgotten: contentment. The quiet satisfaction of work well done, of problems solved, of connections made with people who saw him not as an alpha king or cursed being, but simply as Marcus, a man willing to lend a hand. 3 days later, when they prepared to leave for the next village, half the population gathered to see them off. The blacksmith pressed a small iron token into Marcus's hand, a wolf wrought in simple, honest metalwork. "For luck," he said gruffly. "And so you remember us." Marcus tucked it carefully next to Lily's wooden carving and smiled. "I don't think I could forget." The road stretched ahead, leading to other villages, other people, other chances to build something better from the ashes of the old world. And for the first time in 2 centuries, Marcus Thorne walked toward the future with hope.